The chamber had 10,000 seats, and most of them were full. Velsorath had sat in his seat for so long that the cushion had taken the shape of him. He was old. Older than the current version of the Council's charter. Older than the peace treaty with the hegemony. Old enough to remember when the chamber smelled different, before the ventilation was upgraded, before the third tier was added, before the war, that no one officially called a war anymore. He had seen 847 sessions. He expected this one to be forgettable. The humans were on the docket at position 7, behind a trade dispute between the Virani Collective and a minor moon system, and after a resource licensing argument that had been running for 11 years, and would probably run 11 more. Position 7 meant the Council was not particularly worried. Position 7 meant this was, in their estimation, a routine matter. Velsorath had read the file. He was not sure routine was the right word. He watched the chamber fill. He watched species he had known for centuries settle into their seats with the comfortable slowness of people who believed nothing surprising was going to happen today. The hegemony delegation arrived in their red and black, as always, looking like they were attending a funeral they had arranged themselves. The Aravathi sent only one representative, as they always did. A small gray creature, so old it was almost translucent, sitting very still in the front row. The human delegation came in at position 6 on the entry roster. There were 3 of them. One was a young aide, carrying a large stack of paper, actual paper, pressed and bound, which caused a small ripple of bemused attention from the delegates nearby. One was a security officer who looked at everything in the room once, and then stopped looking, which Velsorath recognized as the behavior of someone who had already memorized it. And the third was Director Yael Okafor. She was not physically large. She wore dark clothes with no decoration. She walked to the human seat at the delegate table and sat down and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked straight ahead at the council speaker's podium. She did not look around the room. She did not greet anyone. She waited. The speaker called the session to order. The trade dispute took 40 minutes. The resource licensing argument was tabled again, which surprised no one. And then position 7 was called, and the speaker's voice shifted into the particular register that meant what was coming next had already been decided. That was the first thing Velsorath noticed. The register. The council did not announce it as a hearing. They announced it as a reading of terms. The charges were listed. Unauthorized terraforming of contested Moon 7, Raven, without a galactic development license. Extraction of mineral resources from a zone under council jurisdiction without a registered extraction permit. Engagement with and defeat of a hegemony border patrol in a zone where human military vessels were not authorized to operate. Each charge was read cleanly, without drama, the way you read a grocery list. The hegemony delegates sat very straight during the third charge. The defeat of their patrol had not been large. A skirmish. 3 ships against 1. The one human ship had won, and then left without taking any salvage, and without sending any communication. Which was, Velsorath had always thought, the part that bothered the hegemony most, the leaving without a word. The punishment was read next. Planetary quarantine. Full spectrum. No outgoing trade licenses, no incoming trade licenses, no galactic communication relay access, no travel permits for human vessels beyond their own solar system boundary. No council-affiliated species was permitted to conduct commerce with Earth or any human-controlled territory. The quarantine would last 50 years, at which point Earth could petition for review. 50 years. For 3 charges, each of which, tried individually, would have earned a fine and a warning. The chamber was quiet. Not the quiet of shock. The quiet of people who had already known what the verdict was and were simply waiting for it to be official. Velsorath looked at Director Okafor. She was taking notes. By hand. On paper. Her pen moved steadily, while the speaker read the terms, and she did not look up, and her face did not change. She wrote the way someone writes. When they are not writing down the words, they are writing down something underneath the words, something the words were carrying without meaning to. When the speaker finished, there was a pause of 30 seconds allocated for response. 30 seconds. For a planetary quarantine. That was how much they were worth being heard. Okafor put her pen down. She looked up at the speaker's podium for the first time since she had sat down. She looked at it the way you look at something you have already finished with. She said 7 words. "We accept. We'll remember you did this." Her voice was quiet. It did not shake. It did not perform anger, or grief, or defiance. It was the voice of someone filing a document. Someone placing something into a folder that would be retrieved later. Someone near Velsorath laughed. A soft, dismissive sound. Others followed. The hegemony delegation did not laugh, but 2 of them smiled, which was almost worse. Velsorath did not laugh. He watched Okafor gather her paper notes into a neat stack. He watched her stand. He watched the aide with the paper files follow her, and the security officer who had stopped looking around fall into step beside her. He watched all 3 of them walk toward the chamber exit without looking back. They did not hurry. They did not slow. They walked at exactly the pace of people who had somewhere else to be. His junior aide, a young Thalassian named Sorvin, leaned over. "You look troubled," Sorvin said quietly. "It is done." They accepted without argument. Velsorath watched the door close behind the human delegation. "That is what troubles me," he said. He had seen 847 sessions. He had seen species argue, plead, rage, threaten, weep. He had seen proud empires reduced to begging at that table. He had seen the guilty perform innocence, and the innocent perform guilt, and every combination in between. He had never seen anyone file it. She had not argued because argument was not what she came to do. She came to collect something. A record. A date. A specific account of who did what, and when. She came the way you come to a place to mark it, not to change it, but to know exactly where it is so you can find your way back. "We'll remember you did this." Not a threat. Not a promise of revenge. Something more patient than both. Something that would sit quietly in a drawer for 50 years, and not once lose its shape. The quarantine went into effect at midnight, Galactic Standard Time. At 12:01, every human communication frequency went dark. Velsorath sat in the empty chamber long after the other delegates had gone. The lights had dimmed to their overnight setting. The great hall was still and gray and enormous around him. He thought about the way she had walked out. He thought about the notes on paper. He thought about the word remember, how it was not the same word as retaliate, and how in some languages, in some mouths, it was more dangerous than any of the words it was not. He went home and started a private file. He did not know why. He labeled it with the date and the human delegation's docket number and 1 word of his own. Watch. 47 years of nothing is not actually nothing. It looks like nothing. It sounds like nothing. Every council report filed during the quarantine period references Earth in past tense, the formerly active human trade route, the previously licensed human extraction zones, the human-occupied system, currently under sanction. Past tense, as if the planet had already finished happening and was simply waiting for someone to write the last line. The galaxy moved on. New species were admitted. Old disputes were settled or abandoned. 3 border wars started, and 2 of them ended. A star in the outer rim went quiet in a way that worried the astronomers for 2 years before they decided to stop worrying about it. The hegemony expanded into 2 new systems and called it development, and nobody argued. Trade boomed, then contracted, then boomed again. Earth was a footnote, a lesson told to newly admitted species during their orientation briefings. This is what happens when you do not follow procedure. This is what it costs to win a fight you were not supposed to win. Velsorath added to his private file. Not often. Once or twice a year, when something came across his desk that did not quite sit right. A small thing each time. Easy to explain away. Easy to file as equipment error or clerical confusion, or the kind of bureaucratic noise that accumulated naturally in a civilization spanning hundreds of star systems. Year 3 of the quarantine. A hegemony patrol near the boundary of the restricted zone reported sensor ghosts. 4 readings over 6 weeks, each one resolving as nothing when they went to investigate. Filed as equipment calibration failure. The ship was serviced. The readings stopped. Velsorath wrote it down. Year 9. A merchant named Orvis Varani, licensed, reputable, 17 clean years of trade record, violated the quarantine boundary to sell contraband goods to a black market contact. He was caught on his way back. The customs officers who searched his ship found his cargo hold full of goods he had not carried in. New goods. Human-manufactured goods. Tools, mostly. Precision instruments of a design that did not match any catalog currently in circulation. When Orvis was asked how they got there, he said he did not know. He said his hold had been empty when he crossed the boundary, and full when he came back, and he had not stopped anywhere in between. He was fined for the original contraband violation and released. His account of the cargo was recorded and then placed in a miscellaneous file and not followed up on. Vel-Sorath obtained a copy of the tool designs and looked at them for a long time. He could not identify what some of them were for. He added them to his file. Year 14. A communications relay near the planet Humans called Jupiter Council property, placed specifically to monitor quarantine compliance, was found not working. This was not unusual. Relays broke. But when a maintenance crew was sent to repair or replace it, they found it had not broken. It had been taken apart. Carefully. Completely. Every component removed and taken. In its place, attached to the relay's anchor strut, was a piece of paper. The paper had writing on it, not in any language currently in the Council's translation database. After 3 months of analysis, a xenolinguist identified it as Latin, a dead human language, thousands of years old, predating first contact with any other species by a significant margin. It said, "Receipt acknowledged." The xenolinguist's report noted, somewhat nervously, that the phrase had the grammatical structure of a formal accounting record, as if someone had received an invoice and was confirming it. Vel-Sorath read the report 4 times. He added it to his file. The official council position on these incidents was that they were unrelated, explicable with some effort, and not indicative of any quarantine violation serious enough to escalate. The quarantine was intact. Earth was contained. Contained things did not reach through their containers and leave notes. And so the council explained each anomaly separately and never put them in a row. Vel-Sorath put them in a row. By year 22, his file had 31 entries. 3 species had moved to absorb Earth's former trade routes, the commercial lanes the humans had been working before the quarantine shut them out. One of those species, the Merveth, collapsed within 4 years. Their economy had been more dependent on human-adjacent infrastructure than anyone had realized. And when they tried to replicate it, they found they could not. It was not that the infrastructure was complex. It was that parts of it did not exist in any official record. They had simply been there, functioning, and when the humans were removed from the equation, the parts that no one had officially cataloged stopped functioning too. The second species, the Karasi, barely survived their transition period. They reported strange inefficiencies, supply chains that worked on paper but not in practice, navigation routes that were charted correctly but took longer than they should, as if something had been subtly optimizing their routes for them without their knowledge, and the optimization had stopped. The third species, the Pell Confederacy, thrived. For 11 years they thrived, expanding into the old human commercial zones, with apparently little difficulty. Then an audit found that several of their most profitable operations were built on top of infrastructure they had not constructed and could not account for. The infrastructure was good, better than anything the Pell engineers could have built at the time. It had simply been there, underground and underwater, and inside asteroids, waiting. No one officially said the humans had built it. No one officially said they had built it while they were supposedly locked inside their solar system, restricted from all external operation, complying with the terms of their quarantine. Vel-Sorath said it. In his private file. To no one. Year 38. A medical journal published a treatment for Kethley syndrome, a degenerative nerve condition that had been classified as incurable by council medical consensus for 200 years. The paper was published anonymously through a relay point that traced back to an unregistered node in unclaimed space. The treatment worked. Council hospitals tested it, confirmed it, and implemented it within 18 months. 11 billion patients across 6 species began receiving care. The author was never identified. Vel-Sorath looked at the unregistered relay node's coordinates for a very long time. He was retired by year 40. He was old enough that his body had begun the slow negotiation that bodies begin when they are deciding whether to continue. He kept his file on a private device beside his bed. He added to it less often now because the entries were becoming harder to categorize. The early ones had been small sensor ghosts, a merchant's confused cargo, a missing relay. These later ones were larger and quieter and more troubling in the way that deep water is more troubling than a rapid. Not because of the noise it makes, but because of how much of it there is, and how far down it goes. Year 46. 11 species in the outer systems that had been experiencing food shortages for a decade without full council relief funding had all quietly stabilized. No new trade routes could account for it. No new agricultural initiatives were on record. Their food supplies were stable and nutritious, and, when a visiting scientist ran a detailed analysis on samples from 3 different systems, came back with an atmospheric signature consistent with a growing method that had not been registered with any Galactic Agricultural Board. The scientist filed a report. The report went into a miscellaneous file. Velsorath was dying by then. He knew it. His doctors had given him the careful language that means, "not long now," without using any of those words. He spent his last weeks in his chair by the window with his private file in his hands, reading through 38 years of small things that added up to something he could not name but could feel. He wrote his last entry on a morning when the light was doing something particular with the dust, and the silence was comfortable rather than empty. "They are not surviving," he wrote. "They are preparing. I do not know for what. I am afraid it is for us." He thought about filing it somewhere official. He thought about sending it to someone who still had a desk and a title and the authority to do something with it. He closed the file and held it, and looked out the window. He died 11 days later. His granddaughter, Sorvin's daughter, a young archivist named Vel Kana, found the file while sorting his effects. She read it carefully, beginning to end, all 38 years of it. She was a methodical person. She placed it into proper archival housing and labeled it correctly, and stored it somewhere appropriate, which meant somewhere that could be found. She did not report it to the council. She was not sure why. She thought about it for a long time. She decided that she did not report it, because reporting it would have required her to summarize it, and summarizing it would have required her to decide what it meant. And she was not sure it was her place to decide what it meant. She thought it might be better for the people who did it to explain what it meant, in their own time, on their own terms. 47 years, 4 months, and 11 days after the quarantine began, a formal request arrived at the council registry, a petition for a session, filed by the human delegation, completed correctly, in triplicate. All documentation in order. Each sitting delegate received a gift with the petition filing. No one knew how the gifts had been delivered. The council's own security logs showed nothing crossing any checkpoint. The packages had simply appeared on delegates' desks, between one shift change and the next. Each gift was different. Each one was exactly the kind of thing that particular delegate would have wanted, and never mentioned to anyone outside their own home. Velkana received one too, though she was not a delegate. It was a small bound copy of her grandfather's private file. Every page was already translated into Thalassian. On the inside cover, in handwriting that was not her grandfather's and not any hand she recognized, someone had written one line. He was right. Tell them he was right. The chamber had not changed. That was the first thing Ren Castellan noticed when he walked in. The same 10,000 seats, the same gray walls, the same speaker's podium at the front, raised high enough that whoever stood at it was looking slightly down at everyone else. The same careful geometry of a room designed to make whoever was being heard feel small without being able to point to any specific reason. He had read everything about this room. He had studied the sight lines and the acoustics and the specific curve of the delegate table and where the light sources were placed and what that placement did to the faces of the people sitting at the table and how that might affect how they were perceived by the people in the seats. He found it a comfortable room. He had prepared for rooms exactly like it. He walked to the human seat and sat down. His delegation of 12 settled around and behind him with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. One of them, a woman named Prisa, the delegation's trade architect, who had been doing most of the actual work for the past 11 years, took out her knitting. She was working on something in a green that did not have a specific name. She knitted the way some people breathe, without thinking about it, without stopping. The delegates noticed the knitting. Castellan let them notice it. The council speaker called the session to order. She was new, relatively. She had only been speaker for 6 years. She had not been present for the original quarantine reading. She knew it from records, which meant she knew the facts of it without the texture of it, without the memory of what the room had felt like when Okafor walked out. Castellan knew what it had felt like. He had interviewed 4 people who were there. He had the transcripts of Velsorath's private file. He had Okafor's own account, recorded 30 years ago in a small room on Earth, in a voice that was careful and dry and entirely without self-pity. He had 7 words memorized that were not his own, but that had made everything that followed possible. The speaker opened by acknowledging that the quarantine period had technically elapsed. She used the word technically with the gentle emphasis of someone offering a face-saving exit. She invited the human delegation to begin their petition for reinstatement of trade licenses, communication relay access, and general council membership standing. It was, structurally, a generous offer. It said, "Come back in. We will pretend the door was always open." Castellan let her finish. He waited 1 full beat of silence after she stopped speaking. Not a dramatic pause. Just enough time for the offer to fully land and sit in the room. Then he said, respectfully, that they were not there to petition for reinstatement. The speaker blinked. It was a small motion, barely visible, but Castellan had been watching for it. He explained. He kept his voice even and his language simple, because simple language in a room like this, where everyone was expecting complexity and legal phrasing and diplomatic hedging, landed harder than anything elaborate. During the quarantine, he said, Earth had been unable to participate in galactic trade. This was accurate. So Earth had developed its own. He placed a document on the table. Not a petition. Not a request form. A report. A trade network summary. 41 star systems. 12 species, all of them, he noted without particular emphasis, under various forms of council sanction or exclusion at the time initial contact was made. 17 mutual defense agreements. A shared communications infrastructure running on frequencies the Council's monitoring equipment was not calibrated to detect. And a banking system, a full, functioning interspecies banking system that had processed 11 years of transactions without once touching a Council-licensed financial relay. None of it was illegal. He was careful to say this clearly. The laws that would have made it illegal applied to Council members. Earth was not a Council member during the quarantine period. They had made sure to check. He slid a second document across the table. The specific legal citations were on pages 4 through 19. The chamber was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of routine. This was the quiet of a room, recalibrating. A senior Thalassian delegate, old, careful, the kind of person who had attended enough sessions to have opinions about the chairs, looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Castellan. "These are not the terms of a petitioner," he said. "No," Castellan said. "These are the terms of a partner." "Yes," Castellan said. "That is the point." He did not say it with heat. He did not lean forward, or raise his voice, or perform any of the body language that gets classified as threatening. He said it the way you state a thing that is simply true. The sky is that color. The water runs in that direction. These are the terms of a partner. Prisa did not look up from her knitting. In the observer gallery above and behind the delegate table, Hegemony Admiral Sosveth had been sitting for the past hour, with the particular stillness of a military officer who has been ordered to attend a political session and is performing patience while feeling none of it. She had read the quarantine file. She had been 8 years old when the quarantine was imposed and had grown up hearing about humans as a cautionary example, which meant she had grown up with a specific image of them, small, reckless, now contained. She ran a scan on the human delegation's ship while Castellan was talking. Routine. Standard security check for any non-council vessel docked at the chamber station. She expected a diplomatic transport, something mid-sized and formally registered, and carrying the appropriate credentials. The scan came back wrong. She looked at it. She adjusted the parameters and ran it again. The ship docked in Bay 14 was not a diplomatic vessel by any classification in the Hegemony's database. It was not a diplomatic vessel by any classification in the Council's database either, which she cross-referenced because she was thorough. What it was, what the mass readings, the internal architecture, the docking clamp pressure distribution, and the energy signature all agreed it was a mobile fabrication unit, a factory, a moving shipyard capable of constructing and fitting vessels up to a certain tonnage while in transit between systems. She sat with this information for a moment. Then she pulled up the station's docking manifest for the past 6 hours. Bay 14, Bay 7, Bay 22, Bay 3, Bay 19, Bay 31, Bay 9, Bay 12, Bay 8, Bay 27, Bay 16, 11 ships total, all registered under the human delegation's filing, all listed in the manifest under the generic category of diplomatic support vessels. She scanned Bay 7, Mobile Fabrication Unit. She scanned Bay 3, Mobile Fabrication Unit. She stopped scanning after Bay 9 because the pattern was clear and continuing would not change the pattern. She sat back in her observer seat and looked down at Castellan, who was still talking in his quiet, even voice about trade agreements and legal citations, and the specific calendar dates on which various agreements had been signed, while Prisa knitted something green that did not have a name. 11 ships, all of them factories, parked at the Council's own station like they belonged there, which, Sosveth realized with a sensation she could not immediately name, they did. They were docked legally, registered correctly, all documentation in order. She wrote a priority message to the Hegemony High Command. She thought about what to say. She thought about how to describe what she was looking at in a way that would not get her assigned to a desk somewhere for the rest of her career. She wrote, "The human delegation arrived in 11 mobile shipyards. I believe this is deliberate. I believe this is not the largest of them. Please advise." She sent it. She looked back down at the chamber floor. The council speaker had called for a recess. The recess was supposed to be 30 minutes. It lasted 9 days. During those 9 days, Castellan's delegation used the station's guest facilities with perfect courtesy. They ate in the common area. They were pleasant to the staff. They did not hold any meetings that anyone could identify as meetings. Prisa finished her knitting project and started a new one in a color that was somewhere between rust and old blood. On the 8th day of the recess, Velkana Velsorath's granddaughter, the archivist, found Castellan alone in the station's observation lounge, looking out at the dock where Bay 14 sat. She told him about the file, about her grandfather, about the last note. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her how long her grandfather had been watching. 38 years, she said. Castellan looked at the ship in Bay 14. He was right, he said. Tell whoever needs to know he was right about all of it. She nodded. She had already been told to tell them exactly that. She asked him, because she had to, because she had been wondering for 9 days, was it planned? From the beginning? Had Okafor known, when she said those 7 words, what the next 50 years would look like? Castellan thought about it. She knew what we were, he said finally. She knew what happens to us when you put pressure on us. She didn't plan the specifics. She just knew the outcome. He looked away from the ship. The outcome is always the same, he said. It has been, for a very long time. The session reconvened on day 9. The vote took 4 hours. Earth's terms passed. Not unanimously. 3 species abstained. But they passed, and the new framework was written into the Council's standing agreements, and the human delegation's trade network, 41 systems, 12 species, the bank, the infrastructure, the defense agreements, was recognized as legitimate. When the speaker read the final language into the record, she paused before closing the session and said that the Council would be including, in the official record, the statement made by Director Okafor at the original quarantine reading, 47 years and 4 months and 11 days prior. She read the 7 words aloud. The chamber was quiet the whole time she read them. It was the quietest Castellan had heard 10,000 seats be. The 9-day recess produced one document. It was classified at the highest level the council had. It was distributed to every sitting delegate simultaneously on the morning the session reconvened. No one claimed to have ordered the distribution. The council's own records showed that the document had been sent from an internal relay node, correctly formatted, correctly authorized, using a clearance code that had been valid 11 years ago and had since been retired. Someone had kept a copy of the code. The document was a summary, 47 years of what Earth had actually been doing, compiled from intelligence gathered across the quarantine period by 12 different agencies, 6 of which had not been sharing data with the others. The summary put the data in one place for the first time. Delegates read it in their offices during the recess. Some of them read it twice. Some of them called staff in to confirm what they were reading, and then sent the staff away and sat alone with it for a while. The session reconvened. The chamber was full. Word had moved, as word does, and the observer gallery was crowded with people who had no vote but wanted to be in the room. Castellan sat at the human delegate table with the same delegation he had arrived with. Prisa was knitting. The color she had moved to today was a quiet gray, very even, very consistent. She did not look up. The speaker opened the session. She did not address the document directly. She said that the council had reviewed the human delegation's terms and was prepared to discuss them formally. Her voice was careful in the way that voices get when they are working hard to carry more weight than they were designed for. The first hour was careful. Species speaking in the cautious, hedged language of people who are not yet sure what version of events will become official and do not want to be on record backing the wrong one. Trade language, procedural language, the comfortable noise of a bureaucracy that has been running long enough to have developed very good ways of saying nothing with great authority. Then an older Thalassian delegate named Os Perith, who had been in his seat since before Castellan was born, put down the document and looked at the table for a moment, and then looked up and said, clearly and without hedging, that he wanted to talk about what was in the report. The chamber shifted. He talked about the FTL research. 3 separate propulsion methods developed during the quarantine, not modifications of existing technology, not improvements on council standard approaches. New physical principles. The kind of theoretical work that took centuries under normal research conditions, with full access to galactic knowledge databases and peer review and the accumulated science of 1,000-member species. Earth had done it in 47 years, in isolation, with access to none of the above. He talked about the famine relief, 11 outer rim systems that had been underfunded by council relief programs for a decade, all of them quietly stable for the past 6 years. The food in those systems, when tested, carried a growth signature that matched no registered agricultural method in the current database, but did match. When a specialist ran a deep comparison, a method that appeared in early human agricultural filing records from 30 years ago, just before the quarantine shut down their external communications. Humans had been feeding 11 star systems worth of people, without credit, without trade revenue, without anyone knowing, for 6 years. He talked about the medical research. The Cathali syndrome treatment, published anonymously a decade ago, now used in council hospitals across 6 species. An 11 billion patient treatment, developed somewhere in a quarantined solar system, and released for free. The chamber was quiet in a way that was no longer about calculation. It was sitting with something. The hegemony delegation's lead negotiator, a sharp-featured woman named Av Thesson, who had been in that role for 20 years, and had negotiated the terms of 4 separate border agreements without ever visibly losing her composure, sat with her hands folded on the table and said nothing for a long time. Then she said that she wanted to note, formally, for the record, that the hegemony patrol defeated in the original border skirmish had been recovered intact. All 3 ships, all crew, alive, with no injuries beyond those sustained in the exchange itself. The human vessel had left them functional and had repaired 2 systems on 1 ship before leaving, without being asked, without leaving any message. She said this, the way you say a thing you have been sitting on for a long time, and have finally decided, needs to be said. She said the hegemony had filed that detail as a minor notation in the original incident report and then not looked at it again because it had not been convenient to look at it. The room was quiet. The small, gray, almost transparent Aravathi representative who had been sitting in the front row without moving or speaking for 9 days. The same as always. The same as they had been doing for 6,000 years of council sessions. Sent a private message to Castellan's delegation tablet. No one saw them send it. The tablet registered it at 11:42 inches the session. The message was 7 words long. Its contents were never released to the public. Castellan read it under the table. His face did not change. He looked up. The species in the room were processing the report in different ways. The Thalassians had gone very quiet in the specific way of people who are revising a long-held belief and finding the revision uncomfortable but necessary. The Varani collective delegates were talking in low, rapid voices among themselves, running numbers, recalculating positions. A species called the Muravan, who had been among those most vocal in supporting the original quarantine, had sent their junior delegate to ask for a procedural break and been denied, and were now sitting with the particular stillness of people who would very much like to leave the room and cannot. Then a young delegate stood up. He was hegemony. He was new only 2 years in his seat, which in hegemony terms meant he was still in the phase where he believed that saying the true thing loudly was the same as having power. He was not wrong about the first part. The true thing, in a room full of people who were thinking it, has a weight that lands differently when it is spoken, he said, his voice carrying more feeling than diplomacy usually allowed, that none of this made sense. That the quarantine was designed to diminish Earth. That 50 years of isolation from trade, from technology exchange, from the galactic knowledge base, should have set them back, should have made them smaller. That was the whole point of a quarantine, to demonstrate that a species could not function outside the Council's framework. He looked at Castellan directly. You should have come back diminished, he said. Why aren't you diminished? The chamber was very still. Castellan looked at him for a long moment, not with contempt, not with performance, with the specific attention of someone who has been asked a real question and is deciding how much of the real answer to give. We were raised, he said, on a planet that tried to kill us for 4 billion years. He let that land. Earthquakes, he said. Floods. Ice ages. Disease. Predators. Our own sun. The planet itself, poisonous and violent and indifferent. He paused, and then each other for a significant portion of the time after that. He looked at the young delegate without blinking. Quarantine was weather, he said. We know what to do with weather. No one spoke for a moment that stretched. Os Parith, the older Thalassian, looked down at his hands. The hegemony negotiator Av Thesson unfolded and refolded her hands. The Muravan delegate who had wanted to leave the room looked like they had stopped wanting to leave the room and started wanting something else, though it would have been hard to say what. The young hegemony delegate sat down. He did not say anything else for the remainder of the session. But he did not look away from Castellan again either. He watched him with the expression of someone who had asked a question expecting a certain kind of answer and had received a completely different kind, and was now rearranging furniture in his mind to make room for it. The vote began in the afternoon. It ran for 4 hours. There were arguments, counter-proposals, amendments offered and withdrawn, and offered again, in slightly different language. 3 species abstained rather than voting either way, which in council terms meant they were watching to see how history settled before they committed to a position. Bureaucratic caution. Nothing new. The terms passed. When the speaker read the final acknowledgement into the record, the chamber made a sound that was not quite applause and not quite silence. Something between them. The sound of a very large room of very different beings arriving at the same realization at slightly different moments. Castellan looked at the document in front of him. He thought about Okafor. He thought about 38 years of a careful old Thalassian adding entries to a private file. He thought about 11 systems eating food they did not know was grown 400 light-years away by people who were supposed to be locked in their own solar system, suffering. Prisa rolled her finished gray knitting into her bag. She took out a new skein of something warmer, a color like early morning, before the light has fully decided what to be. She started the new project without looking up. Outside, in Bay 14, the smallest of 11 mobile shipyards sat in its dock with the patient quality of things that have already done most of their work, and are simply waiting to do the rest. 5 years after the readmission, the Thalassian Historical Institute commissioned an official account of the quarantine period. This was not unusual. The Institute commissioned official accounts of most significant events, eventually. They had a methodology interviews, document review, cross-reference testimony, a careful attempt to build a record that would still make sense when read 1,000 years from now by someone who had no memory of what it felt like to live through it. The researcher assigned to the human chapter was a young historian named Vel Sareth. She was Vel Soreth's great-granddaughter. She had not asked for this assignment. She had been given it because her supervisor felt that access to Vel Soreth's private file, which Velkana had since formally donated to the Institute's collection, made her the natural choice. She had read the file. She had read it many times. She knew her great-grandfather's handwriting well enough now to hear his voice in it. She requested an interview with Ren Castellan. He agreed without hesitation. She had half expected him to decline, or to offer a prepared statement in place of a real conversation. He did not. He met her in a small room at the council's administrative offices. Not the chamber, not anywhere formal. Just a plain room with 2 chairs and a window, looking out at the docking yards. And he was on time, and he brought no staff. She had a list of questions. She worked through them methodically, the way the Institute had trained her to. He answered in the same quiet, unhurried way he did everything, and she noted that his voice was the same in a small room as it had been in the chamber. No difference in register, no sense of performance in either direction. When she had worked through most of her list, she asked the question she had been saving. Was it planned? Was Director Okafor's statement, the 7 words, "We accept. We'll remember. You did this," a declaration of intent? Had the next 50 years been built from that moment deliberately, systematically, as the execution of a plan she had already made? Castellan thought about it, not the way people think when they already know the answer and are deciding how to phrase it, the way people think when the question is genuinely interesting to them. She knew what we were, he said finally. She was not strategic about the specifics. She didn't draw up a plan that night and lock it in a drawer. He paused. She knew something more basic than a plan. She knew what happens to us when you put pressure on us. Vel Sareth asked him what that was. He thought about how to answer. He looked at the window for a moment. Outside, ships moved through the docking lanes. Dozens of species, hundreds of vessels, the ordinary busy traffic of a civilization going about its day. Some of those ships ran on infrastructure that had not existed 6 years ago. Some of the cargo they carried was moving through trade channels that had not existed 12 years ago. The galaxy had, in certain specific and measurable ways, reorganized itself slightly around the network Earth had built during its quarantine, the way water reorganizes slightly around a new stone placed in a river. There is a thing that happens to water, he said, when you make it cold enough. She waited. It restructures. At the level of individual molecules, it reorganizes. It becomes geometrically different from what it was, harder, more regular, sharp-edged in ways that formless water is not. The same pressure that would crush most things, that would collapse most structures, causes water to become. He paused, looking for the right word. Architectural. He looked back at her. The quarantine was cold. The council applied cold deliberately, expecting that cold would mean shrinking, getting smaller, coming back diminished, as someone in that chamber once put it. He was quiet for a moment. What actually happened is what always happens to water. She wrote this down. She wrote it down carefully because she understood that this was not metaphor as decoration. This was the explanation she had been sent to find. This was the actual account of what had occurred and why. She asked the question she had not planned to ask. It was not on her list. It arrived because the conversation had moved somewhere that made it necessary. She asked, "Should other species be afraid of humanity?" Castellan's face did something that was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a person who has heard a question and recognized it as the right question not because it is comfortable, but because it is honest. And honesty, even when it points somewhere difficult, is always preferable to the kind of careful phrasing that obscures more than it reveals. "You were afraid of us when we were young and loud, and broke your rules without knowing what the rules were, he said. She waited. Now we are older, he said. He did not add to this. He let it sit exactly where it landed, which was in the space where several different things could be true at once, that humans were not a threat to a peaceful galaxy, and that they were not quite what they had been before the quarantine, and that whatever they were now was something for which the existing language was slightly insufficient. She thanked him and packed her materials and left. She spent 3 weeks writing the account. She was careful. She was fair. She included Velsorath's file entries in full, from the first watch to the last. She included the details of the Kethely syndrome treatment, the famine relief, the infrastructure built inside asteroids, in systems the Council had labeled impassable. She included the mobile shipyards and the Latin note, and the merchant Orvas, and his inexplicable cargo, and the communications relay that had been dismantled and left a receipt. She included Castellan's words about water, and then she included one more thing, which she had not planned to include until she was nearly finished and realized it was the only ending that was accurate. The Erevathi representative, the small gray ancient creature, who had been attending council sessions for 6,000 years, who had sent Castellan a private message during the reckoning session that had never been released, had finally allowed the message to be quoted. They had sent the Institute a formal release. They had specified that it should appear at the end of any official account. They had not explained why. When you had been attending sessions for 6,000 years, you had presumably earned the right to not explain yourself. The message was 7 words. We have waited for you for this long. Velserith wrote this at the bottom of the account. She looked at it for a while. She thought about her great-grandfather sitting by his window, adding to his file, year after year, watching the anomalies accumulate into a shape he could feel, but not quite name. She thought about Okafor walking out of the chamber without looking back. She thought about 11 systems, eating food grown 400 light-years away by people who were supposed to be diminished. She thought about water. She submitted the account to the Institute. In the official record, as mandated by the readmission agreement, Okafor's 7 words sat at the head of the quarantine period entry. Below them, as an addendum filed by the Thalassian delegation in honor of Velsorath, was his final file note. I am afraid it is for us. And below that, added by a human archivist in the notation style of Earth's own record-keeping tradition, handwritten, on paper, then scanned, and officially entered 2 lines. You are right to be. You are right to be. Velserith read this and sat with it for a long time. It was not a threat. It was not a boast. It was the kind of statement that only makes a certain kind of sense after everything else has already happened, the kind that reads like a warning before the fact, and like a simple truth after it. She thought about what Castellan had said. Now we are older. She sealed the account. She sent it to the Institute's senior editorial board for final review. She cleared her desk. She put on her coat. Before she left the office, she stopped at the window. The docking yards were lit against the evening, the warm orange of council station lights, the white blue of thruster wash, the slow, patient movement of ships going somewhere they had decided to go. Somewhere in one of those lanes, a vessel was running on a drive system that had not existed 50 years ago. Its cargo might be food from a farm that had no official registry. Its medical bay might carry a treatment that had been published by no one in particular, for everyone who needed it, for free. The galaxy had reorganized itself slightly around a stone it had tried to bury. She stood at the window for a while. Then she went home. In the Institute archive, Velsorath's file was entered into the permanent public collection that night. Every entry was accessible. Every anomaly logged. Every year marked. Every small and careful observation he had made in the long decades when he was the only one watching. At the very beginning of the file, before the first entry, before even the label and the date, was a single handwritten line on a small square of paper that had been found tucked inside the file's cover. It was in his handwriting. No one could date it. It might have been written at the beginning, when he first started the file, or at the end, when he was nearly done. It was the kind of sentence that would have been true at either moment. Something is being built in the cold. I don't know what it is yet, but I know it will be here long after I am not. Below the last line, in a different hand in ink, rather than the stylus Velsorath used, In a script that cross-referenced as standard human administrative notation, someone had added 3 words. You were right. And after that, nothing. Just the white space of the page, holding the weight of everything that had followed from a thing as simple and old and patient as water, deciding to freeze.